Here we will explore how blood pressure is regulated. There are two short-term regulations of blood pressure. One of them is neural, that is, it is controlled by the brain, and the other is hormonal. And the one major long-term regulator of blood pressure is renal. So it comes from the kidney, and we'll see that there are direct and indirect responses from the kidney to maintain blood pressure. So let's begin with the short-term neural response. So the short-term neural response is referred to as the baroreflex response, and it begins with baroreceptors that are located in the aorta, in the carotid artery, and also in the carotid sinus. Baroreceptors are pressure-sensitive cells, so the prefix baro in this case is referring to pressure, and they detect stretch in the aorta and the carotid arteries. Higher blood pressures in these structures correspond to greater stretch in the walls of these arteries, and this information is then communicated with the brain through sensory neurons. So let's take a look at this feedback from this system. So let's say that the arterial blood pressure is low. This inhibits the sensory neurons in the baroreceptors, and as a result, they send fewer impulses to the brain. So this reduction in impulses stimulates the cardioacceleratory center and the vasomotor center of the brain. And both of these centers are located in the medulla oblongata of the brainstem. The cardioacceleratory center stimulates an increase in heart rate and in force of contraction, which raises cardiac output. And the vasomotor center stimulates the smooth muscle in the muscular arteries to contract. This decreases the diameter of these vessels, which also aids in increasing blood pressure by increasing resistance in these blood vessels. On the other hand, if arterial blood pressure is too high, this stimulates the baroreceptors to fire more impulses to the brain. And these increased number of impulses stimulate the cardioinhibitory center, and at the same time they inhibit both the cardioacceleratory center and the vasomotor center in the medulla oblongata. So stimulation of the cardioinhibitory center in the brain causes the heart rate and the force of contraction to decrease. Inhibition of the vasomotor center causes the smooth muscle in the muscular arteries to relax, which dilates the blood vessels and decreases the resistance. So these events cause cardiac output and blood pressure to fall as a result. Another short-term regulator of blood pressure are several hormones from the endocrine system. So let's examine a few of them in this table here. So at the top left, we begin with epinephrine and norepinephrine. Both of these hormones come from the adrenal gland and are part of the sympathetic nervous system response to short-term stressors. Both epinephrine and norepinephrine increase blood pressure by increasing cardiac output and increase blood vessel resistance by constricting the arterioles. Angiotensin, the second hormone on the list, is produced by the kidneys, and it serves to increase blood pressure by vasoconstriction in the arterioles. Antidiuretic hormone is produced by the posterior pituitary gland in the brain. It controls blood pressure in two ways. The first is to control vasoconstriction of the arterioles, and the second is to conserve water in the kidney tubule cells. The kidney tubule cells are responsible for eliminating excess water from the blood by passing that water into the urine. Antidiuretic hormone functions to retain body water by reducing urine formation at the kidney. So even the name antidiuretic reflects its function. It inhibits urine formation. Aldosterone is a hormone that's produced by the adrenal gland. Its primary target is the kidney, and it functions to regulate sodium retention by the kidney. Aldosterone increases blood pressure by increasing sodium absorption in the kidney tubules. So later we will see that when sodium is retained, water follows sodium by diffusion, which means that if more sodium is retained, more water is also retained, which keeps blood volume high and increases blood pressure. And our last hormone is atrial natriuretic peptide, which is produced by the atria of the heart. It essentially has the opposite effect of aldosterone at the kidney. It causes sodium loss and water loss through the urine, which decreases blood volume and blood pressure when blood pressure is too high. And we see that it also works to dilate the arterioles, decreasing the resistance and decreasing blood pressure as a result. So now that we have explored the short-term regulators of blood pressure, we can examine the long-term regulators. There are two long-term regulators, both involve the kidneys. They are the direct renal mechanism and the indirect renal mechanism. Both renal mechanisms, as we will see, have the same end goal. They help to increase blood volume, which also increases blood pressure. The direct renal mechanism on the left side of this diagram occurs when blood pressure falls, specifically the arterial pressure. This drop in arterial pressure automatically decreases filtration rates for the kidney, because as we will see later on, the kidney's filtration is highly dependent on arterial blood pressure. So when filtration decreases, urine formation also decreases, which helps keep the blood volume high and increase blood pressure as a result, or at least maintain blood pressure as a result. The indirect renal mechanism, which is also called the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone mechanism, is slightly more complicated, but even it is not too bad. When arterial pressure drops, the kidneys release a hormone that's called renin. Well, more specifically, renin is actually an enzyme, and it is an enzyme that converts a substance called angiotensinogen into angiotensin 1, which angiotensin 1 is then converted into angiotensin 2 by an enzyme called angiotensin converting enzyme, or ACE. ACE inhibitors are a class of drug that work to decrease blood pressure by preventing the conversion of angiotensin 1 to angiotensin 2. So we see that angiotensin 2 has the following effects. The first is that it stimulates the adrenal glands to release aldosterone. As we just saw, aldosterone is a hormone that increases sodium absorption by the kidney, and in doing so, water follows sodium by osmosis and keeps the blood volume and blood pressure high as a result of that. It also increases the release of antidiuretic hormone, or ADH, from the posterior pituitary gland, which is a hormone that helps the kidneys retain water and put that water back into the bloodstream, which raises both blood volume and blood pressure. We see that angiotensin 2 also increases thirst, which promotes water intake, thereby increasing blood volume and blood pressure. And it also promotes vasoconstriction, which increases the resistance of the arterioles and increases the blood pressure. So now we know how blood pressure is controlled, let's look at some imbalances in blood pressure regulation. Hypertension is a major imbalance in blood pressure regulation, and it is defined as a sustained arterial pressure of 140 over 90 millimeters of mercury. It comes in two varieties, simply called primary and secondary hypertension. Primary hypertension represents the majority of hypertensive cases, which is why it's referred to as primary hypertension. Interestingly enough, it has no known cause. And why is that? Because there is a huge interplay between genetics and environmental risk factors. So speaking of which, the major environmental risk factors are things like diet, primarily sodium intake, obesity, age, diabetes, and stress levels. The remaining 10% of hypertensive cases are secondary hypertension. Risk factors include things like renal problems. As we just saw, the kidney plays a large role in regulating blood pressure, so any problems there will also tend to create blood pressure problems as well. Arteriosclerosis is a hardening of the walls of the smart arteries and the arterioles with age, which would play a huge role in their ability to change their resistance. And we also see that hyperthyroidism is a condition that plays a role in secondary hypertension as well. This is a condition in which the thyroid gland is overactive, and it secretes high amounts of thyroid hormones. This tends to increase blood pressure because thyroid hormones help to increase things like heart rate. So newer guidelines list normal healthy blood pressures as less than 120 over 80 millimeters of mercury, so that is systolic and diastolic pressures. Elevated blood pressures, that is pre-hypertensive levels, are systolic blood pressures between 120 and 129 millimeters of mercury, and diastolic is less than 80 millimeters of mercury. Stage 1 hypertension represents a systolic pressure between 130 and 139, or a diastolic between 80 and 89 millimeters of mercury. And stage 2 hypertension is a systolic a sustained systolic blood pressure of at least 140 millimeters of mercury, or a diastolic of at least 90 millimeters of mercury.